But if you've been here for the last few weeks, you may have heard the story about how we chose our On Fire series. It actually originally started as a Hot One series. Does anyone know? Do we know? Great. For those people that don't, it's a YouTube show where his name's Sean. He talks to celebrities, asks them questions, and they eat hot wings, and they get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So my husband loves spicy things, and he loves wings, are his favorite food. So this was his idea. He was like, let's do hot ones. He also loves this show. And I looked at him and about said, are you trying to kill me on stage? Because I don't do spice. I will sit there looking like a dog because I'm like, I don't. And so when we talked about this, I literally almost was like, yeah, I'm going to be gone for those 4 weeks. Like, I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to speak. I just won't be here. But we then shifted the message to be, or the sermon series to be On Fire. And I'm not kidding. I got so excited. And I knew exactly what I wanted to preach on. And it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because this has been one of my favorite Bible stories since I could walk. I grew up Southern Baptist in Montana, and don't ask me how that happened, but it did. My mom, I look at her sometimes. She was a founding member of our church, and I look at her and I'm like, how did we get Southern Baptism in Montana? And she goes, I don't know, man. I was born and raised in Georgia. And I was like, oh, so that's how it happened. Okay, good. But I grew up in this church. There were only about 100 people. Still to this day, it's the same families. I went back last summer and I was like, I can name everyone in here. I don't know your kids, but I can name all of you. So it was a very tight, close-knit church. I loved it. It was my favorite thing. And my 2 best friends also grew up in this church with me. They were the people I spent all of my time with. Their names were Hannah and Noah. And if you ask my mom, I was named after Mary. So we were raised in the church, if you couldn't tell. Like, that's just our names, everything. We ran the church. I learned how to do slides when I was 7, which is wild because at that time, the literally a box computer, it was on PowerPoint. Yeah, that's still how they do slides. I literally went back up into their tech booth last summer and was like, so nothing's changed. Okay, cool. Great. Montana, you're really stuck here. I see. Okay. But my favorite thing about my friends, especially growing up, is that we all had the weirdest favorite Bible stories for 10-year-olds. Like I said, mine was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I also love the story of Samson, who literally gets crushed by a temple. I thought his hair was cool. That's what happens when you're 10. My friend Noah's favorite Bible story was, and I kid you not, the beheading of John the Baptist. And when Herod's daughter asked for his head on a platter. She said this to me when we were about 10, straight face, dead eyes. And I was like, we might need to rethink this friendship because I don't know why that's your favorite story, but it is, I guess. For me, I loved the weird and wild endings to all of these stories. And I'm not going to lie. As an English major and a words lover, the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego felt so fun to me as a kid. I've since learned that culturally there's nothing fun about their names, and so that's not why I like the story anymore. But as a kid, I was like, yes, let me say those names over and over and over again because they're so fun. As an adult, this is still my favorite Bible story, like hard stop. It is. I'm tattoo free, unfortunately. But me and needles don't get along very well. But this is the story that I talk about most frequently about getting a tattoo to represent because I love it so much. And I think it's such an important reminder of what God can do and where he can show up in your life. Like I said, I'm seriously so stoked. I have so much energy. And if most of you guys know me, I'm not the Energizer Bunny on most days. I'm like, keep me at home. But today, I'm so excited to talk about this. This has actually been, for somebody this is their favorite story, this has been the hardest message I've ever had to write. Me and Pastor Aeric have gone back and forth multiple times on it in a good way. I want everyone to know. And we had a call about it, and it was really great. And I'm so excited about where it's landed because I think that it has the potential to impact everyone's life here, but including my own. And so I'm going to dive in to our series. But in order to do that, I need to start a few weeks ago with Pastor Natalie's first sermon. And she asked what she called one of the most personal questions you can ever be asked. Does anyone remember what she asked? Yeah. Okay, you get a pass. She asked, "Are you a pyromaniac?" Yeah, okay. Full disclosure, I did raise my hand. Thank you, B. I see your son back there. But as she talked, she told a story about how she has these really pretty matches, and she is the only person in my life that if I pass a matchbox or a set of matches, I think Natalie would like those. Especially when they're like this long, and I'm like, that could be dangerous. But she told a story about how she has a set of very beautiful matches, and she lit one the other day to light a candle in her house, and then she got sidetracked watching it burn all the way down to the tip while Rigby was yelling at her that mom was going to set the house on fire. And it really dawned on me in that moment that I'm not that type of pyromaniac. I'm not the type that stares at fire subconsciously, but I am the type that looks at something and says, how long do you think this would take to burn? And so, as a Girl Scout, yes, this is also why I got really frustrated last week when Natalie mentioned Boy Scouts, and I was like, I'm a Girl Scout, bro. Because as a Girl Scout, I learned how to start a fire with flint and steel when I was about 10. I could start a fire in rain, shine, snow. I did way too many snow survival experiences for someone that grew up in Montana. But if you're out in the cold with me, I got you, man. I can start a fire with almost anything. And because of that, that's what led me to question what and should I throw into a fire. I started with things like paper plates, which is perfectly fine to put in a fire. I then moved to garbage, which don't do that because it smells awful. My favorite thing to put in a fire, and please don't hold this against me, unfortunately, is gasoline. As a youth group person, that used to be our favorite form of lighter fluid. I want everyone to know that the person that was in charge of my youth group bonfires was also the person in charge of our city's fire extinguishers. So he did have, some background and knew how to put out the fire if necessary, but he was also the one that supplied us with the gasoline. So I'm not really sure what that was all about. But it was this question and all of the things that I ended up throwing in a fire as a kid that really led me to change up my s'mores ingredients. I don't use chocolate, I use Reese's now. Fun fact for everyone. This is what led me to test the flammability of gummy bears. They don't catch fire. I want everyone to know that. They also barely melt. So do with that what you will. This is also what led me to vow to never, ever, ever put a peep over an open flame again. It was the worst thing I've ever experienced in my life. That's not true, but it was really bad. And my mom loves Peeps, and I told her, I said, that's on you, dog. I'm not doing that again. So it's all sugar. So the sugar caramelizes, and then it's an awful smell, worse than garbage. I can only tell you that. So anyway, it was this question, though, that led me to then also be like, I have this insatiable curiosity about fire. And I'll be honest, I also have a huge fear of fire. House fires and structural fires are actually one of my greatest fears. And yet here I am, somebody who likes to throw things into the flames. Don't ask me what that's about. But I did do some research because I needed to know why fire is so beautiful and why I'm so drawn to it. So what I found is that campfires, and I spent a lot of time around a campfire growing up, but campfires usually burn under 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Structural fires usually burn over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That will be important later. It's not right now. But fires can also double in size in 30 to 60 seconds. They're incredibly powerful and incredibly fast. They can also change colors based on the oxygen level in fire, so they're also incredibly beautiful. Also, when you dive into the history of fire, you find that it has been used for purity and revival. But as I'm sure we're all well aware, it's also been used as a form of capital punishment. There is a balance between fire, because what's important to remember is that fire can be beautiful and devastating. There's two sides of it. When used in the right circumstances, fire, like campfires or glass blowing, can be used to bring comfort and warmth and create beautiful works of art. When put in the wrong hands or used in the wrong way, fire can be devastating. A spark can instantly turn to a wildfire. Like I said, I grew up in Montana. This was my life. But again, fire can also be used to kill and to bring devastation onto people. So there's this balance, this give and take between what fire is and what it can and cannot do. God often uses this tension and balance between fire not to punish, but to purify. And that's important to remember, because throughout Scripture, fire isn't just a tool of judgment. It can be, but it's not only a tool of judgment. It's also a tool of refinement. While physical fire can melt down metals to remove impurities, spiritual fires can melt down and refine our responses to idols in our world, like pride and fear. And it's in the midst of this balance between beauty and devastation, purity and refinement, that we find our protagonists, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love it. There's so much here. There's so much to unpack. So we're going to start in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 3 is where the big meat of our story is. But Daniel chapter 1 is where we meet Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know why, but his name was always my favorite growing up too. I literally asked Pastor Aeric earlier this morning, I said, so how do I pronounce this? Because I wanted to not be pronouncing it wrong for my entire life. I wasn't, thank God, literally. But in Daniel chapter 1, King Nebuchadnezzar declares war on Judah. And during his reign, the first temple of God is built and destroyed. King Nebuchadnezzar's advisors and chief eunuch then choose strong, young, and able-bodied men to be brought into the palace to be taught language and literature. Here's where we meet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are three of these men chosen by the king and his eunuchs. So in Daniel 1, 6 through 7, we read, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So today's message doesn't focus on Daniel, but I included him here because it's really important to note that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were on an equal playing field with Daniel. We hear a lot of stories. We talk about Daniel all the time, but it is important that they were at the same level as him. They were chosen for the same purpose, and they were chosen by God, just as Daniel was, for this story and for us to learn from. It's also important to note that the reason they were in the palace, the why they were well-educated and well-fed, was because they had been forcefully taken from their homes, taught to worship other gods, and then re-educated in a culture that was not their own in order to shut down the Jewish culture. That is important. That is dangerous. That's painful. So they had privileges, and they were chosen because of their promise and their prowess, but it came at a price. And if you couldn't tell I was an English major before that sentence, you can now. The amount of P's. I wrote that and I said, God, you really did it. You really did this sentence today. Sometimes. But anyway, it's here that we meet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Again, they're also mere teenagers, and they're in charge of the province of Babylon. So that is where we're at. They've been stripped of their names. They've been given titles that they didn't want in a culture that wasn't their own. And in Daniel verse 3, we also learn that King Nebuchadnezzar has decided that he's going to build himself a golden statue. I really love when kings build statues of themselves. But I encourage everyone to go and read Daniel chapter 2 because it's incredibly ironic why he chooses a golden statue and then actually makes it. He has a dream, and Daniel basically tells him, you're gonna die. Like, your kingdom's going to end. And he says, yes, let's build a statue of gold for me. Yeah, okay, cool. But to give us a little bit of perspective, the statue is 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Think the obelisk in Stinson Park in Exarban. That statue is 90 feet tall. So it was that tall and wider than that, and of King Nebuchadnezzar. And when he made this statue, he commanded that Babylon's leaders, including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, instantly fall to their knees and worship anytime they heard any type of music. Which is wild with the amount of music that we listen to on these days. You'd be on your knees at all times. There's no work getting done. That's all I have to say. In Daniel 3:4-6, we read, "Then the herald loudly proclaimed, 'Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace.'" And I bet you can guess what happened next. Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. They refused to worship anyone besides their own God. And don't worry about Daniel. Like I said, the story is not about him. But at this time, it was just to give you some sense of peace. It was thought that he was out of the country. So he had no idea that any of this was going on. And he was not in any danger. So we meet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As you can imagine, King Nebuchadnezzar was enraged. As a king who has asked his people to bow to him and to worship, he was angry. These were the boys he had educated, the ones he had chosen, those that were in charge of his province. And then he did what I never expect any ancient historical ruler to ever do. He gave them a second chance. We don't hear of that very often. As the king, it was his right to call them into his throne room and immediately sentence them to death. He had given a proclamation and they had disobeyed. Instead, he called them into his throne room and he asked them to try again, basically. He said, "If you're ready, you can bow down now." So it's really important that we take a second to think about this. Like I've mentioned I'm an English major. I have a degree in literary analysis. This is the first time, not the first time, but one of the times in the Bible that I sat and I was like, God, that's not normal. Like, why was he giving them a second chance? The king clearly stated that anyone that disobeyed the decree would be dead on sight, basically, and would be thrown into a fiery furnace. So why this matters is that this second chance is its own kind of fire. It's not the first fire that they've come to, but it's its own kind of fire. It's not physical, but it's hot, it's unbearable, it's uncomfortable. This is the moment where real refinement happens for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is where we see the purity of their hearts, what the other fires had been leading up to. This was when the stakes were life and death. And this is the second chance that the king did give them. We could have assumed that maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego hadn't heard the summons. For all we know, because we only have what the Bible has given us, they could have been deaf, hard of hearing, out of the country like Daniel. I mean, maybe they didn't know that this was happening because there were no iPhones then. For all we know, we had no idea why they had chosen to not follow this decree. So given a second chance, they could have fallen to their knees and walked away unscathed, literally. Instead, they chose to try again with God. They said no, and they responded with conviction. They said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Can you imagine standing up to a king and saying, I don't need to tell you why I'm not following what you say? First off, I love them for this. But they follow that up by saying, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." When we use the phrase "on fire," this is the type of conviction that I'm talking about. This is the type of dedication that I picture. Being on fire requires you to surrender to the truth. We use the phrase "on fire" in a lot of different contexts, but there is one single thread that connects them all. For example, when we say that an athlete is on fire, what we're actually saying is that they have practiced to the point where their inner faith replaces their outer fear. This is the type of on fire that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show in the face of death. And I can almost guarantee you that they did not want to be the only ones standing up when everyone was bowing down. They did not want to stand out. But more than that, they were unwilling to sacrifice their inner faith and their closeness with their God. That's what's important about why the second chance mattered. Unfortunately, as I'm sure we're well aware, or we can guess, that this was not the response that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted. He would not have given them a second chance if he thought that this was what was going to happen. So not only does he order his soldiers, his strongest soldiers, to throw these men into the fire, he orders them to tie them up in all of their clothes and to heat the furnace to 7 times its original temperature. So let's go back a little bit to when I said that a campfire burns at around 1,000 degrees. A structural fire burns at about 2,000 degrees. This was the Bronze Age when King Nebuchadnezzar was in rule. And so we can assume that a furnace that you can actively walk into was used for smelting and melting bronze for swords and common tools. The melting point of bronze is 1,675 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can estimate that the king ordered it to about 7 times the melting point of bronze, which is 11,725 degrees Fahrenheit. Those numbers mean nothing. I'm well aware. It's hot. Yes. So let me put this in a frame of reference for you guys. And this literally blew my mind when I learned this. This type of temperature, the only frame of reference that we have to it is that of when an atomic bomb is detonated. So in those cases, everything around the detonation site is instantly vaporized, which, when you read Daniel 3, is exactly what happened to his strongest soldiers. They threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, and they immediately died. They were destroyed. They did not need to touch the flame. They did not need to go into the furnace. They were goners, basically. But what we've learned is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not have the same fate. They went into the flames and survived. They should have been instantly vaporized, but they weren't. And the king, amazed, exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." We learn later in these scriptures that not a hair on their heads was singed, their clothes were smoke, soot, and smell free, and their ropes were gone. They were in the flames for quite some time, and yet they walked out of it like it was any other day of the week. Like, this is just, a hot tub. We're having some fun today. They walked out. And so, like I said, this is the reason this story has stayed with me, because we talk a lot about the 4th man in the fire, and that's so important, but there's so much more to it as well. This story, even though I loved it because their names were fun, has so much more to it. There's so much more meaning, so many more questions that we can be asking ourselves because of it. And so I do not want to overlook the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't start with this kind of courage. Like I've been talking about, they experienced fires well before this, when they were torn from their homes and assigned new names, trained in a pagan system, and pressured to compromise their integrity. Each test refined them and burned something away from them, like the fear of man, attachment to comfort, the illusion of control. By the time they stood before King Nebuchadnezzar, there was nothing left to burn away. They had been tested and tried and refined in the fires previously. Only their faith remained. Because like I said, there's 2 sides to a fire. And while it can destroy, it can also purify. For those of you that know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and those of you that don't and have heard me talking about a 4th man in the fire, I don't want you to forget the truth that Daniel 3 is an incredible reminder of God's promise to sustain you in the fire, that he will show up in the most unlikely circumstances, and his ability to deliver you from the most devastating circumstances. But that's not what we're talking about today. Like I said, there's so much to this story, because the question I want to pose today is, why did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stay in the flames? And tangentially, why should we stay in the fire even when there is a clear and open exit? So there's a song called One King by my favorite worship band. They're called MBL Worship. And that's helped me answer this question in my own life. And while it doesn't talk about fire specifically, it embodies the spirits of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because the first lyrics state very simply, Jesus, you paid to have all my life. Half in won't work for an all in God. So let me repeat myself. Half in won't work for an all in God. Half in won't work because God is all in. Half in won't work because he's all in the flames with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and all in our salvation every single day of our lives. There is not a question, there is not a moment that passes where he does not give us the dedication to our forgiveness, and he requires the same from us in every step of our life. Half in from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego meant the end of a nation, the end of a culture. Half in from them was the destruction of who God's people were and are. We couldn't be here today with a half in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So their dedication to an all-in, on-fire approach to their relationship with God literally saved their people and then redirected King Nebuchadnezzar's beliefs. We see this in Daniel 3:28 through 29, when Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." This moment, this is where we see the fruits of their boldness and surrender. It was truly just the culmination of their refinement from the other fires. They had already walked through previous trials that had stripped them of their fear and left nothing but the purity of their surrender. And so the fire didn't touch them because there was nothing left to burn. And I'm going to pull it back even more, because let's look at how King Nebuchadnezzar originally responded when he and his officials realized our boys were just gallivanting around in the furnace. Daniel 3:26 says, "Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here.'" So this furnace, like I said, was putting off enough heat that it destroyed many of the king's soldiers simply from being outside the flames. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to be called out of the fire. For all we know, they would have spent the rest of their lives with the angel of God in the middle of the flames. But because they chose to be all in when they walked into the heat, and they chose to stay in the flames. Worship team, you can come on up. It can be difficult to read this story or to listen to someone talk about and see how it applies to us, especially because I can almost guarantee that none of us are going to face a physical furnace this week, besides literally just the outdoors. But what we can learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the why behind choosing to stay in the flames and choosing to stay through the trials and choosing to say, even if my God doesn't show up, I still won't bow. Why that matters. Because we were all born into a broken world, one with temptation and pain, death, sin. At some point, you will or have experienced trauma, and I'm sorry. But this isn't me saying for you to stay in the trauma or stay in the pain. This is me saying you should stay where God has led you until he calls you out. Staying in the fire with God allows the flames to burn away the impurities of the world, to hone your talents, and to build up the right fireproof type of treasures to meet your God in all seasons of life. This is where we feel closest to God. In fact, we feel more on fire with holy fire the closer we get to hellfire. I said it. And I'll tell you the truth, you can leave the fire at any time. You don't have to stay there. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stayed because they knew that in the fire, in the heat, in the flames, they were given direct community with their God. Being on fire for God doesn't just mean when the blessings are coming. It's not kept to the times that it's easy. Being on fire is more important when your opponent is in your face and blocking your game-winning shot. Being on fire is so much more important when the world is trying to convince you that it's worthy of your love, when you're staring down the barrel of a fiery furnace, when your pain is overwhelming, when your death is imminent, when you are tied up and shackled. That is when an on-fire, all-in existence matters the most. Unlike the fire of a physical fire, an on-fire life can morph beauty into pain, or pain into beauty, not beauty into pain, sadness into joy, and apathy into passion, and so much more. It is the space where spiritual balance and transformation is found. You can't be half in the fiery furnace. Whether or not you're standing directly in the flame, you will get burned. So here's the question for you this morning. Are you standing outside the furnace, feeling the heat and hoping to catch fire from a safe distance? Or are you willing to step in and be all in with God? Because God didn't promise that we wouldn't face heat. We will be tempted. We will try to follow other kings, the idols of impurity, self, security, sacrifice, safety. God did promise that we'd never be alone in the flames. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't survive the heat because they were superhuman or stay in the fire because they were fireproof. They stayed, they surrendered, they survived because they trusted God with their whole lives before they knew the end of the story. So today, Dwell, where is God calling you into the fire, not away from it? Where is he calling you to live like you're already walking in victory, even if the furnace is still burning in front of you? And what is he calling you to surrender to, promising that he is right there next to you? You won't always feel bold, you won't always feel brave, and you won't always feel on fire. But the beauty of faith is that it's not about feelings, it's about surrender. And when you surrender, the fire won't destroy you. It will only burn away what doesn't belong to God. So let this be your prayer this week. Not for the flames to vanish, but for the faith to stand inside them and let them refine you into who God has called you to be.
Thank you, Mari, for a great word. I got a question I want to end today's message with to send you home with a choice. We're all experiencing the fires of life, and most of them are unintentional. It's just life. It's just kind of, and that's the interesting part of this story is like they didn't choose to get captured. They didn't choose to be tested in this way. Like they weren't opting into the all of the stuff that this Babylonian king was trying to do to them. But then when faced with an option to choose what fire they're going to walk into, they willingly do it. There's a whole other version of this story that thank God we never get, which is live to fight another day. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hey, will you bow down to the king? We'll bow down this time, and then we'll game plan. We'll start a rebellion so then we don't have to do it ever again. Like that's a version of this story we don't get, which is live to fight another day. Live to avoid the fire one more day. What we do get is them making a choice. This is the fire I'm going to walk in. I don't know for certain, but I believe God will be in that fire. And even if he isn't, he has been with me beforehand. What a bold statement. So I got a question for you. Are you done letting the world choose things, the fire that's going to be surrounding you? Or are you going to choose the fire? So here's how that looks. Is there an addiction in your life that you get to choose the fire? The fire is, I'm done. And the fire is, I'm going to be tempted more than I've ever been to go back to that addiction, to try it again. This is one of the things they talk about in AA is, man, that's why you get a chip in your first week. It's going to be the hardest week. And it doesn't make it like you're going to be tempted later on. But man, that first decision is to just step into, and I'm going to choose to take control again. I'm going to choose my fire. How about this? Is there a relationship that you've been negotiating? You've seen a couple of their behaviors and actions, and you go, well, I mean, nobody's perfect. And the fire is, well, I'm going to have to be alone for longer. But you're not going to be alone. What we get from the story is in the middle of the fire is where you feel the presence of God the most. It's difficult. I don't know what your fire is. I'm ready to choose my fires. And I'm ready to anticipate God moving through them. Are you guys with me today?